Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. And I'd like to first start by thanking very much Dr. John Downing and the Global Media Research Center Advisory Board for doing me quite the extensive honor of inviting me to speak to you tonight. And I'd also like to thank the college and our dean for the support that I've gotten through my years here as a first-time faculty member, and also for making the Fulbright research possible, the research that I've just come back from. So thanks very much. And I also would like to just mention that what I'm presenting to you tonight is sort of initial thoughts on a lot of research that I've been doing over the past year. So I very much welcome feedback and suggestions and comments. What I'm going to do this evening is outline case studies of 4 different countries, media reform efforts in 4 different countries, to demonstrate 2 main points. And these are the points. My first point is that I would like to encourage us to shift our focus away from the more traditional ways of looking at media systems in a comparative nature. I'd like to suggest that we also use as a lens the militarization of daily life, beyond the normal way we look at it, which is to look at the political system, the economic system behind the media. Because I think this new lens of looking at militarization offers us new important insights into the media structures themselves, and also the reform processes and their impact. And I'll do this by looking specifically at the situation on the ground in the 4 countries I'm looking at. The second point I want to make, and this is kind of where my research is going into new ground here, is that I'm kind of looking at the intersection between militarization and human rights issues. And what I'm really wanting to show you tonight is that I'm finding that the greater the degree of the militarization that people face in their daily lives, the greater the emphasis among both media reformers and also funders of media reform projects on the individual civil and political rights. And that has a tendency, a very strong tendency, to marginalize group rights to communicate. Now, this is very dangerous because it's the very groups who are marginalized in their ability to communicate who are those opposing state policies. And it is those that we need to hear from in order to reduce and eventually eliminate the violence that we're facing in so many places around the world. So what I'm going to do tonight, first I'm going to give you a brief description of the media environments in the 4 countries. They are Burma, also known as Myanmar. We can talk about that later if you want, the name each situation. But I'll call it Burma in solidarity with the democratic movement. The Philippines, Thailand, and as a sort of a comparative study, the United States. 3 of the countries, the Southeast Asian countries that I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour through tonight, are facing political violence of varying degrees. Second, I'm going to discuss the basic human rights frameworks and how individual civil and political rights have come to be prioritized in global discussions of human rights and even have come to be sort of the basis for many of our understandings of human rights, and why this is problematic, especially in areas of politically motivated violence. And then finally, I'm going to just demonstrate how lawyers, guns, and money affect media reform efforts in these various countries and the impact this has on human rights. Okay, so lawyers, guns, and money. Since if it bleeds, it leads, I guess I'll start with guns. And what I'm going to do is take the 4 countries that we're looking at tonight on a continuum of militarization from the country which I believe is has the greatest degree of militarization of everyday life to the least. And just to let you know, I'm broadly defining militarization as the degree to which problems are addressed through violence and coercion. That's a very simplified version, but I think it's enough for right now. Okay, so let's start with Burma, or Myanmar. This is a very highly militarized society. It's been under military dictatorship since 1962, controlled through fear with the censorship of all media. And what you see here is the massive street protest that broke out in September 2007, also known as the Saffron Revolution, so named because of the color of the robes of the monks who led the demonstrations. As happened in 1988, this was sort of a repeat. There was a brutal response from the military, and unknown numbers of protesters were killed. The official government figure is 13. Other figures are somewhere between 80 and about 110 people who were killed. with a couple of hundred people beaten and up to 6,000 arrested. So during this event, and then shortly after this event in May of last year, when Cyclone Nargis slammed into Burma, you may have heard that on the news, the military regime refused to allow, at that particular time, donated aid money into the country, and also refused to allow journalists into the country, foreign journalists into the country. So what happened was many, many people, civilian people, used cell phones to get pictures out of the country at great risk to themselves, kind of a homegrown citizen journalism movement in the city of Rangoon and Mandalay, where most of the violence went on. So much of the crackdown was actually a big focus of international media once this happened, obviously, because it led. And especially when what you see here is journalist Kenji Nagai. He was the only foreigner killed during the protest. He was shot point blank by this soldier here, captured on cell phone video, which you may have seen on CNN and the net and everything else there. And because it led, and as usual, the media in situations like this, they focus on the dangers facing individual Burmese people in the urban areas, which of course is highly appropriate in this situation. But what has tended to happen over the many years of coverage of countries like Burma is that this kind of violence also tends to be focused on, and it overshadows the decades-long practices of ethnocide that the military regime is carrying out in the rural areas. Okay, the Philippines. Also a highly militarized society. The term culture of impunity is one I heard again and again and again when I was talking to media reformers. It basically refers to the fact that, well, basically depending on who is counting, and the definition varies depending on how you define killed in the line of duty. But depending on who you're talking to, somewhere between 75 and 100 journalists have been killed in the line of duty since martial law ended in 1986. And the culture of impunity comes from the fact that of those 100 people who have died, only 3 convictions have been made, and those have been of the assassin, the hired assassin, not the mastermind. So it continues because there are basically there are no negative consequences. And it's cheaper in the Philippines to hire an assassin than it is to hire a lawyer to introduce a libel or defamation suit. This is a candlelight vigil for the slain journalist Dennis Cuesta, who was the most recent of the journalists killed. I was there in August 2008. And so we see the situation remains very dangerous for journalists in the Philippines, especially in highly militarized rural areas, like, for example, the southern island of Mindanao, where there's a Muslim insurgency, but also in other areas where there are controversial activities like logging or mining. Corruption is rampant in the Philippines, and local authorities are very often involved in this violence. And all of this, of course, has an impact on the ability of local people to access media in order to express their concerns. I want to give you one specific example. This is pictures of Radyo Cagayan, which was actually one of the few kind of what we call pure community radio stations I was able to find in the Philippines. This was a station that was organized by a local peasant farmers organization in 2000. Well, they actually they took several years to raise the money from their community in order to buy the equipment for their radio station. And what happened was they went on the air. They were in an area where there were issues of land rights. They went on the air, and they've been on the air for less than a month, when 6 of their staff stayed over one night at the radio station on a Saturday night. They were going to air a dawn mass. During the middle of the night, armed and masked men broke into the radio station, blindfolded and tied up all the staff using the station's microphone and headphone cables, and beat the staff, took them outside, and burned the station to the ground. So what you see here is the staff before and after the siege, and then you see the remains, what's remained of Radyo Cagayan. So I think you can see from this example that militarization has made it virtually impossible for rural people in the Philippines to enact their communication rights. Okay, Thailand. Also, lots of exciting stuff going on in Thailand. I would classify Thailand as a moderately militarized country, although in the last year it's been increasingly militarized. A coup d'etat in September 2006 was the latest in a long string of 17 coups stretching back decades in Thailand. This one, however, has ushered in a particularly nasty period of political divisiveness. And rather than get into all the details of that, because it's very complicated, I'll basically just say that the coup had been, for a long time, called for by the People's Alliance for Democracy, which is a very misnamed group. You can see them here. They're actually, this is a group that's taken over the airport, and here they are as well. You can see them holding up a picture of the king. They took over the government house in August of 2008, and in December took over the 2 international airports, virtually shutting the country down for 10 days from any kind of international travel and shipping and whatever. Also during this period, there were attacks on the government radio station, the national broadcaster of Thailand, NBT, on the new public service broadcasting station, Thai PBS, and on the cable channel ASTV, which is owned by one of the leaders of the People's Alliance for Democracy. There's kind of a divisiveness, the yellow shirts versus the red shirts, and they're each aligned with a different political power group in the country. Now, violence is perpetrated very much in the name of the king. What's happened in Thailand is lèse majesté. Thailand has a very harsh lèse majesté law with a fine of 3 to 15 years of imprisonment. There's also been recently a recent proposal by the current ruling coalition to expand the maximum sentence to 25 years. It's an extremely harsh law, and what's happened is each of these groups have used this law to kind of target each other as a tool. So all this violence has led to a very unstable political environment and thus a very unstable policy environment as well. During the 10 months that I was in Southeast Asia, Thailand has had 3 different prime ministers, just to give you some idea. So the situation is especially difficult for the growing community radio movement in the country, not for the same reasons as the Philippines, but because there's no legal body to regulate them. There's no licensing body. So they're vulnerable to closure at any time for political reasons. Okay, also murky are the laws for computer users. In 2007, under a temporary interim coup-appointed government, a Computer Crimes Act was enacted. And about a week ago, a friend of mine, a new friend of mine, Chiranuk Premchaipon, she's the director of Prachatai. Prachatai is an online alternative media. It's actually one of the very few and rare independent medias. It's not aligned with either of the political groups, and it's also a discussion forum. So it's a very, very important place for discussion about very controversial topics, including lèse majesté, because people can remain anonymous, so they can be a little bit more open, even though there are ways, and the government's working very hard to try and trace people and so on. But the environment is very murky. Webmasters and ISPs in Thailand are liable for anything posted on their websites, including the discussion boards. So Chiranuk was arrested about a week ago, and it was a strange situation because normally what happens, she works very closely with the Ministry of Information and Communication Technology, and they very often call her to ask her to remove things from the website, which she does, not wanting to be arrested. But this time they didn't. They just came and they raided the office, they searched the whole place. They arrested her for a comment that was posted in October, and which they had never contacted her about. So she's currently out on bail, but she's facing criminal charges under the computer law. And as you can see, this would it sets up a very dangerous situation of self-censorship. Also, just to let you know, since the current government took over, nearly 4,000 websites have been blocked, and the Ministry of Information recently set up a war room to monitor discussions on the internet. Okay, so lèse majesté, the Repressive Computer Crimes Act, and the unstable political and policy environment then leave both community radio and the internet especially vulnerable to closure. And it's unfortunate because these two, community radio and the World Wide Web, are the two places really where marginalized groups are most likely to be able to enact their rights to communicate. Okay, let's look at our own country. This will be kind of quick. I put the United States in here. I think the United States is kind of interesting in that I would argue that we do have a great degree of militarization, but it's kind of hidden. Obviously, we're we are militarized. If you think about the way our media glorify war, both real and imagined wars, especially if they're ours, we're the instigator. If you think about our conglomerates that not only own media interests but also have interest in military hardware, if you think about our war on terror, the whole rhetoric and all the actions around that, which has had a huge influence globally, especially in Southeast Asia. But all of these things, nevertheless, don't really affect most Americans' daily lives. And so I would argue that of the 4 countries here, in terms of the militarization of daily life, this is the farthest on the non-militarized side of the continuum. Okay, there are, of course, exceptions. Very quickly, this is pictures from the Republican National Convention in August, where there were preemptive police raids across the city. Homes of those suspected of planning protests were raided. Police entered them, searched them, seized computers, journals, political pamphlets, handcuffed, photographed, and detained people, and then many of them charged with no crime other than fire code violations. There were more than 400 arrests made over a 4-day period, including 40 journalists. And these weren't all independent journalists. An AP photographer was arrested, ABC producer, 2 Fox News reporters from a local affiliate, 3 staff of Democracy Now!, including Amy Goodman, who's kind of probably the most well-known of the journalists who were arrested. Also 2 students and 1 faculty advisor from the University of Kentucky. So while this led to a great deal of outrage, unfortunately it was not covered much in the mainstream media. And what's happened as a result then, I think partially because we're not so militarized in our daily life, there is space for reaction to this. A campaign for civil litigation has begun. 7 lawsuits have been filed against police misconduct. But when we do see protest events like this covered in the media, they're framed in terms of individual rights. And once again, the tendency is to not really pay attention to the rights of marginalized groups, such as the poor, who are referred to in this middle picture. Billions for the war, nothing for the poor. Okay, so now we have a sense of the militarization facing media in these 4 countries. Before we go on to discuss lawyers and money, let's take a look at the human rights framework that I would like to just lay out quickly for you here. There are 2 major human rights treaties: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This is considered the first-generation right. In terms of media, these rights guarantee freedom of belief, speech, freedom of association, freedom of the press. There's also the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, second-generation rights. The United States has signed but not ratified this covenant, but this basically focuses on conditions necessary to meet people's basic needs. So food, housing, healthcare, that kind of thing. In terms of media, it includes the right to self-determination, to public participation in cultural life, the right to be protected from discrimination, the right to education and academic freedom, all of which I think in some way have a relationship with the media. So we have kind of a hierarchy of rights here, and over time we've seen that international organizations and trends in international law have tended to prioritize individual civil and political rights, and also funders have done the same. The United States as well tends to focus on these rights, and in many cases our international aid is tied to a recipient country's respect for human rights as defined in these terms. Okay. For a long time, though, as far as media goes, there's been a call to recognize the right to communicate as a fundamental human right, and this is often kind of associated with collective or group rights because it's often the marginalized groups in society who most need the right to communicate as a group. Okay. We saw this call as early as the New World Information and Communication Order debates of the 1970s and early 80s. More recently, the World Summit on the Information Society. These issues still are front and center in terms of what are we doing with global media and global media governance. So the question I want to ask then is, how do media reform efforts reflect a desire to assure the right to communicate as well as individual civil and political rights? In other words, how do lawyers, guns, and money in these countries affect people, and especially marginalized people's rights to communicate? So we've talked about guns. Let's talk about money. And by that, I want to look at political economy very briefly, and lawyers, which is the legal situation, and look at how they affect the people and efforts at media reform. Okay. In Burma, as far as money or political economy goes, the broadcasting and daily papers are state-controlled, There's a private sector of weekly and monthly magazines, but again, it's highly censored. As far as lawyers, the legal situation goes, this is a very highly militarized society. Media are censored or self-censored or in exile or underground. And so really, it's not possible at this point to enact any meaningful or stable legislative structure to address media issues. As far as the people, the civil society has basically been very cowed in Burma, although some underground movement still continues. And just to give you some sense of the way that the military regime thinks, this is the statement that appears in every single printed publication in the country. And I especially like the bottom one, crush all internal and external destructive elements as the common enemy. And unfortunately, what this also shows you is that internal destructive elements have a tendency to be identified as the ethnic minority groups that ring the country's border areas. Okay. So as far as media reform goes, there really isn't any inside. Outside the country, the focus has been really, especially because of the influence of foreign funders, on professionalism in journalism, newsroom management skills, and over the last 20 years, a real shift from media that were allied to opposition political groups, moving now into a real movement for independence among the media. But what's happened is, especially during the Saffron Revolution and Cyclone Nargis, is that these events benefited the big Burman majority media rather than those of the ethnic minority groups. And this was because, first of all, much of the violence happened in the urban areas where the major Burman majority media have stringers, and they also are developed enough that they could get information out very quickly. So we see that this violence has privileged the already well-developed media and has kind of, unfortunately, left the ethnic minority media a little bit behind. Okay. The Philippines. As far as money or the political economy, the structure of the media, it's commercial media. The Philippines was a US colony, and its constitution, its media laws are derived very much from our constitution and our provisions for protections of rights to speak and that kind of thing. Okay. Unfortunately, it also, as you can see, ownership is concentrated among a few powerful families in the Philippines, which also have multiple holdings outside of media, so there's all kinds of similar conflict of interest situations going on there. The political economy of the media also means that many journalists cannot earn a living wage, especially in the provinces. There's a lot of media and not as much audience as they would hope. So this leaves journalists very vulnerable to corruption because they don't make very much money. Okay. So as I mentioned, there are solid protections in the Constitution and the laws, but very little enforcement, and this is where the culture of impunity comes in. And there are no provisions in the Constitution or the laws for community media. Now, there's a very active civil society in the Philippines, but unfortunately not in the area of media reform. I think a lot of people are really just focused on making a living and trying to protect their families and their groups from the kind of violence that we've seen some evidence of. And so as far as media reform goes, a veteran journalist has described Philippine media as worse than free because of the vast corruption, the culture of impunity, and the violence. So reform organizations in the Philippines are not at all focused on community media. They are focused basically on safety for journalists and activists. And this leads them to really push for professionalism. A lot of journalists are corrupt, as I mentioned, because of their vulnerability based on the fact that they can't make much money. So media reform efforts have really pushed for professionalization of journalists. And in many ways, this has marginalized community media because, for example, broadcasters are expected to be accredited by the Association of Filipino Broadcasters, which means you can't just have a community radio person legally go on air. So it's a way that the media reform movement inadvertently has kind of squashed the ability, in addition to the violence, the reform efforts themselves also are playing a role in making it difficult for local broadcasters and local marginalized groups to use their communication rights. In Thailand, Thailand has a commercial private press, but broadcasting has traditionally been run by the state, or leased by the state on concession to big businessmen. So even if you have private television, it relies on the state for its concession to that license, and so it's going to be beholden to the concerns of the state. The 1997 and the most recent 2007 Constitution both have progressive changes for media and community media. This is actually a very big change in Thailand. There's a recognition of 3 sectors of media: state, public, and, public meaning state, private meaning commercial, and community media. There's actually legal recognition of this, and that was only gained because Thailand has a very and increasingly active civil society. Okay, the unstable legal environment makes it very difficult. There's been a new constitution on average every 4 years, so that's kind of interesting. And that's been since the end of the constitutional monarchy. The problems include libel as a way of controlling journalists, defamation suits, national security used as a means of censorship, and lèse-majesté, as I mentioned before. So in the increasingly active civil society, however, has meant that in terms of reform, we have kind of 2 groups in the Philippines which are interesting. The professional media groups like the Thai Journalists Association and the Thai Broadcast Journalists Association, which are focused primarily on media reform. But we also have some very important civil society groups that are working on community media, like the Community Radio Movement, the Campaign for Popular Media Reform, and a new group called the Thai Netizen Network, both of which are really focused on increasing access for people and creating space for people's media outside of the mainstream. United States, okay, I don't have to go through this very much. I think you all know this, but we have a commercial system with a weakened public service and community media sector. We have experienced a loss of localism, especially since the deregulatory environment since the 1980s. And a loss of diversity, both of ownership and content. We have good protections in the Constitution and our laws, but our regulatory body lacks strength in the face of commercial media lobbyists and neoliberal federal policies. But we also have very active civil society groups. So a growing media reform movement since the early 2000s. We've had actually several waves of media reform in this country, most recently, though, as the FCC has tried to roll back regulations even further, there has been a growth of a grassroots movement against this. The focus, however, is on legislative change to protect neutrality, to protect the internet and net neutrality. They focus on low power FM, universal broadband, localism, and the loss of localism, ownership diversity, and those kinds of things. The biggest organization currently is Free Press. And I think the name indicates the group's priority there, but I think it's important to look at what they're actually doing. Yesterday's daily email update from this group demonstrated a concern with broadband access on tribal lands. This is in the debate about how to use the broadband stimulus package money. Also issues of localism and local access to media, and the promotion of new community radio legislation. So it's clear that we have a civil society, very active civil society group working on media reform, and there is a space to expand space for people's rights to communicate. Okay, so I want to just talk about a couple of trends as a conclusion. And start out by saying I think this shows us the value of using militarization as a lens through which to examine media and reform efforts. And just to take a second, if we look, for example, at the Philippines and the United States, normally, if we were looking at the economic system or the state structure, we would consider these countries fairly similar in that they have similar, their democratic systems, the constitutions, the legal structures are very similar. Economically, there's a lot of differences, and that makes a big difference. But I think in terms of, if we look in terms of militarization, we can see there are huge differences between the Philippines and the United States. But on the other hand, if we look at the Philippines and Burma, 2 highly militarized societies, very different state structures, very different political economies, but some very significant and similar consequences of militarization that have a direct impact on media reform, the media landscape, media reform efforts, and people's abilities to communicate. Okay, so militarization, I think, we can see increased risks for marginalized groups who want to make media. Also leads to violence, the violence itself, and to reform efforts that focus on individual rights, which overshadow group rights to communicate. This is certainly understandable when people are being attacked. Of course, you're going to focus on that. But I think it's really important that we kind of up the ante and look also at groups themselves. Focus on militarization shows us the need to challenge the emphasis on individual rights and to promote marginalized groups' rights to communicate. Oops, sorry. So finally, what I'd like to conclude is that if we look at the countries that I've studied, the individual rights of journalists are generally the first communication rights to be defended. And as I've mentioned, a very significant factor in this is the strong transnational focus on press freedom, very much driven by funders from the global north. But the focus on individual rights has a tendency to really keep from our focus the rights of marginalized peoples. And this is really important. We have to really continue to focus on communication rights, to call for attention to communication rights of the groups, of marginalized groups, especially in areas of political violence, because it's the marginalized groups in those areas who we most need to hear in order to expose and address the militarization of society, and who perhaps offer us the best hope for change. Thank you.